أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Today I'll be speaking about the Muslim liberal problem, and I will be also looking at some history books, some philosophical stuff as well, of course, and understanding the issues Muslims are facing at the moment. And though I am not perfect, far from it, I still like to break down some historical and political concepts that exist at the moment. And so, may Allah forgive me for coming across as a know it all, which is not the case, of course. It's my role simply to put forward solutions and texts that have been mistreated by Muslims themselves. So, first of all, I would like to begin with Arnold Toynbee's book, Study of History. So, a bit of background: Arnold Toynbee is famous British historian, and he has done extensive work trying to explain civilizations, their rise and their fall, and he places a special emphasis on Islam and the Muslims within the civilizations that existed. So, I'm going to quote a few things here, and this is an abridged version, by the way. This is an abridged version of Arnold Toynbee's Study of History from volume 1 to 6. And I'm going to break down something that really caught my attention. So we'll begin with page 3 here. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. On the genesis of the Industrial Revolution in England, no higher authorities could be cited than Mr. and Mrs. Hammond in their preface to their book, The Rise of Modern Industry. They take the view that the factor which goes furthest towards accounting for the genesis, which means the origin of the Industrial Revolution in England rather than elsewhere, is England's general position in the 18th century world, her geographical position in relation to the Atlantic, and her position in respect to the European balance of power. It seems then that British national history never has been, and almost certainly never will be, an intelligible field of historical study in isolation. And if that is true of Great Britain, it is surely must be true of any other national state a fortiori. So a fortiori is Latin for with even stronger reason. Okay, and I'll explain that in a second here. Right. So what's being stated is that the period of industrial revolution that Britain was going through should not be completely isolated as, oh, it's the industrial revolution that's happening, right? It must be in tandem with the geographical aspects, the colonial aspects, of course, and the varying conditions and the environment that was created during that time. Our brief examination of English history, though its result has been negative, has given us a clue. The chapters which caught our eye in our glance backward over the course of English history were real chapters in some story or other. But that story was the history of some society of which Britain was only a part, and the experiences were experiences in which other nations besides Great Britain were participants. The intelligible field of study, in fact, appears to be a society containing a number of communities of the species represented by Great Britain. Not only Great Britain herself, but also France, Spain, Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, and so on, and the passage quoted from Acton indicates the relation between these parts and the whole. So Acton was a famous politician from England, and he said the following: general history naturally depends on the action of forces which are not national but proceed from wider causes. The rise of modern kingship in France is part of a similar movement in England. Bourbons and Stuarts obey the same law, though with different results. So this is quite cogent because how can it be that the opportunities that exist at the moment in England, for example, are supposedly equal, but someone who's eaten educated yet ignorant can be perceived as a decision maker when it comes to any moral equivalency to a narrative or debate, whereas that individual who may not and most have not been part of the Eaton sphere or the Epstein regime do not have an equal share. Yes, England and France seem to be similar, but what I'm trying to imply here is that when we look at media narratives being pushed, in particular the disgusting Army Hammer film, which is obviously funded, produced, and created by the Baal Talmudic demons, it shows a scene where the so called vigilante is literally massacring a family in Europe. And this family in Europe is justifying the rape of a white woman, and the son who does this heinous crime, instead of being prosecuted through a legal process and rightfully given the capital punishment treatment, the vigilante goes about starts unaliving everyone. So, if the same was to shown about the Baal Talmudic representatives based in occupied at the moment, so in occupied, it's important that we show the truth, right? But that never comes to the surface. There have been riots trying to free the ones that raped the prisoners, for example. There have been lawmakers and influential figures that can say whatever they want, whenever they want. And the international law, which doesn't exist, is arbitrarily put forward as the gold standard against which society must run in general. So all of that's been exposed. However, at the same time, the factors at play are not only national, but they have wider causes. So a Muslim is instantly, for example, in England, said to condemn XYZ on behalf of 2 billion or so people. However, a Baal Talmudic demon is not interrogated and questioned in the same manner. Neither a Christian is confronted regarding the disgusting remarks by Kirk or any of the other reform so called Christian politicians who are agents of Baal, of course. So, this is what's happening here. There are wider causes and there are central national causes. So, from a Muslim point of view, there are issues within the self and the nafs, and there are issues that are outside it, which must be reconciled and addressed, which I will explain in a moment. The forces in action are not national but proceed from wider causes which operate upon each of the parts and are not intelligible in their partial operation unless a comprehensive view is taken of the operation throughout society. Different parts are differently affected by an identical general cause because they each react and each contribute in a different way to the forces which the same cause sets in motion. What does that mean? I'm going to break it paragraph by paragraph. So he states that the forces in action, not national, proceed from wider causes, which operate upon each of the parts, moving parts in society, institutions, for example, and are not intelligible in their partial operation. You cannot understand an institution simply looking at how the curriculum is set up. You need to see how the implementation of said curriculum produces individuals. Unless a comprehensive view is taken of their operation throughout society, so you have to study the whole. Different parts are differently affected by an identical general cause. So different parts are differently affected by the same cause. Let's say the targeting of Muslims, right? It's a very specific faith, which is Islam. And different parts of society where Muslims exist differently affected, okay, by an identical general cause. So the Muslim who's a taxi driver will most likely be abused more than the multi-millionaire billionaire within London or Manchester or wherever. Though there's an identical general cause, which is racism, the idea that he is the enemy. Because they each react and each contribute in a different way to the forces which that same cause sets in motion. So they each react and they each contribute differently to the forces which same cause sets in motion. A society, we may say, is confronted in the course of its life by a succession of problems, which each member has to solve for itself as best it may. So the Muslim society has to solve things by itself at the end of the day. There's no liberal, democratic, please help us, O government, O people of Britain. The presentation of each problem is a challenge to undergo an ordeal. And through this series of ordeals, the members of society progressively differentiate themselves from one another. So the presentation of each problem. So if a problem of racism is discussed with someone from a wealthy socio-economic status, is perceived differently from someone who's middle and from someone who's right at the bottom. Okay. And through this series of ordeals, the members of the society progressively differentiate themselves from one another. So progressively they differentiate from one another. That's why there is constant strife and to a degree an identity crisis. And I really like how Toynbee explains this. And this is what the enemies of Islam have done. They've progressively differentiated, pardon me, they've progressively implemented systems and forces that run contrary to our beliefs, and therefore we have progressively become against each other. Throughout, it is impossible to grasp the significance of any particular member's behavior under a particular ordeal without taking some account of the similar or dissimilar behavior of its fellows, and without viewing the successive ordeals as a series of events in the life of society as a whole. Life of the whole society. So, what is he saying here? Throughout, overall, it is impossible to grasp the significance of any particular member's behavior. So, it's hard to understand an individual's behavior under a particular ordeal, under a particular problem, without taking some account of the similar dissimilar behavior, without taking into account the individual differences, to use a psychological term, of its fellows, and without viewing the successive ordeals as a series of events in the life of the whole society. So what Toynbee is saying that individuals will always differentiate from each other, but it's very difficult to understand the behavior of individuals. that are so different from each other that make up society. So it's very difficult to pinpoint the abuse of one person or one group in a society and then taking a blanket approach and applying it to everyone. I don't know why the word abasement came to my mind here. The act of humbling or degrading someone or the state of being reduced in rank. Yeah, so this act of abasement. So I would say it leads to abasement rather than the act itself being one of abasement. Yeah, so terrible. So I really, really like this point. He then explains Hellenistic history and talks about Greek society as well. Speaking of turning proved to be a blind alley. Well, well, okay, so I just read this and I think it's good that I share it. So he does a breakdown of how Sparta and Athens were similar. So where is right? So I'm going to start from here. In regard to Sparta, for example, excavation conducted by the British Archaeological School of Athens produced striking evidence that down to about the middle of the 6th century, Spartan life was not markedly different from that of other Greek communities. The special characteristics of Athens also, which she communicated to the whole Hellenic world in the so-called Hellenistic age, contrast to Sparta, whose peculiar turning proved to be a blind alley, were likewise acquired characteristics, the genesis of which can only be apprehended from a general standpoint. It is the same with the differentiation between Venice, Milan, Genoa, and cities of North Italy in the so-called Middle Ages, with the differentiation between France, Spain, Netherlands, and Great Britain and other national states in the West more recent times. Yeah, so the Renaissance prior to it was the Islamic Golden Age. So the argument of bringing the Islamic Golden Age when talking about how Europe suffered big time and Muslims played a huge role is a valid argument. It's a very, very valid argument simply because the characteristics are very similar and there is striking evidence to prove this, whether it's literature, whether it's architecture, whether it's dress, of course, philosophy, theology, ethics, hygiene, of course, the STEM fields, so on and so forth. So it's a valid argument. In order to understand the parts, we must first focus our attention upon the whole, because this whole is the field of study that is intelligible in and of itself. But what are these wholes? Which form intelligible fields of study, and how shall we discover the spatial and temporal boundaries? Let us turn to our summary of the principal chapters of English history and see what larger whole is found to constitute the intelligible field of which English history is part of. So there's parts to English history. This is a very interesting portion in the book here. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna read this portion here. This is very interesting. I really like how Toynbee writes. Very nice way of writing. Okay, so let's begin. Bismillah. If we start with our latest chapter, the establishment of the industrial system, before I move forward from here, I have a book on the fall of the British nation, something along those lines. It talks about this concept of industrial revolution. Here we go. The rise and fall of the British nation. Let's check industrial system for a second. Industrial system. Industrial. Industrial policy, reorganization, relations, research. I'm trying to find system, industrial system here. Hopefully it'll be here. Article 6. Yeah, I don't think he Anyway, I just found this book to be of interest. Rise and Fall. Okay, so moving forward here, we find that geographical extension of the intelligible field of study which it presupposes worldwide. In order to explain the Industrial Revolution in England, we have take account of economic conditions not only in West Europe but in tropical Africa, America, Russia, India, Far East. When, however, we go back to the parliamentary system and pass, in doing so, from the economic to political plane, our horizon contracts. The law, which in Lord Acton's phrase Bourbon and Stuarts obeyed in France and England, was not in force for Romanovs in Russia or Osmanids in Turkey or Timurids in Hindustan or Manchus in China or Tokugawas in Japan. The political histories of these countries cannot be explained in the same terms. Likewise, Western liberalism and liberalism as a whole cannot offer a solution or explain the current peril Muslims in England are going through. We here come up against a frontier. The operation of the law, which Bourbons and Stuarts obeyed, extended to other countries of Western Europe and to the new communities planted overseas by Western European colonists. But it is writ, but its writ did not run beyond the western frontiers of Russia and Turkey. East of that line, other political laws were being obeyed at the time within other consequences. So they are trying to challenge the law of Allah with the law of Western Europe. This is what Toynbee is extrapolating from Acton's work at the moment. If we pass back to the earlier chapters of English history on our list, we find that the expansion overseas was confined not merely to Western Europe, but almost entirely to the countries with seaboards of the Atlantic. In studying the history of the Reformation and Renaissance, we may ignore without loss the religious and cultural developments in Russia and Turkey. In studying the history of the Reformation and the Renaissance, we may ignore without loss the religious and cultural development in Turkey. Why is that? The feudal system of Western Europe was not closely connected with such feudal phenomena as were to be found in contemporary Byzantine and Islamic societies. Finally, the conversion, now this is key now. Finally, the conversion of the English to Western Christianity admitted us to one society at the cost of excluding us from the possibility of membership in others. Down to the Synod of Whitby in 664, the English might have become converts to the far western Christianity of the Celtic fringe, and had Augustine's mission ultimately proved a failure, the English might have joined the Welsh and Irish in finding a new Christian church out of communion with Rome, as veritable an alter orbis as the world of Nestorians on the far east fringe of Christendom. Another world. Classical Roman writers they describe remote Mesopotamia. Hmm. Interesting. Later on, when the Muslim Arabs appeared on the Atlantic seaboard, these far western Christians of the British Isles might have lost touch as completely as the Christians of Abyssinia or Central Asia with their co-religionists on the European continent. When the Muslim Arab appeared on the Atlantic seaboard, these far west Christians on the British Isles might have lost touch as completely the Christian of Abyssinia or Central Asia with co-religionists on the European continent. They might conceivably have become converts to Islam, as too many monophysites and Nestorians actually did when the Middle Ages passed under Arab rule. These suggested alternatives might be dismissed as fantastic. These suggested alternatives might be dismissed as fantastic. These suggested alternatives dismissed. Or the contemplation of themselves serves to remind us that while the conversion of 597 has made us one with Western Christendom, it has not made us one with all mankind, but has simultaneously made a sharp line of division between ourselves, Western Christians, and the adherents of other religious communities. So, yeah, this sharp divide we see today between British Muslims now and the British Muslims before. So, what I'm saying is that the generations before tried to integrate, tried to walk, talk, act, eat, drink like the folks here. But now the folks here don't want us. They want us to be cut off from their so-called civilization, not knowing the contributions and the cultural exchange between us. There is a cut-off point, which seems to be the Muslim, that's being used as a tennis ball between two ideas. First is complete union of Europe, sorry, complete unification of Europe, therefore kick the Muslim out. And when the Muslim ends up in lands that he finds some similarity with, or mostly adheres to those laws and customs, the economics to a large degree and the social political landscape does not allow him to, at bare minimum, prosper to the point where he can excel in the STEM field. And that's the dark reality of Muslim lands at the moment. And so this constant back and forth is happening, whilst on this end you have propaganda being propped up, the shape of films, drawings, books, TV shows, podcasters, content online by TikTokers, and so on. And on the other hand, you have ostracized individuals are ostracized, right? And the complete policing of your religion. Same case happens in the western side of the world, but there are some loosely defined terms and some gaps that have been modern that have been created with the intent that okay, this gap we see, this will allow us to pinpoint and pick up the right person. For example, there was a famous operation conducted where in Birmingham, in the Muslim, in predominantly Muslim areas, there were cameras set up everywhere. They can monitor the movement and behavior of Muslims. It was exposed later on by a female Muslim lawyer, and she's been attacked and she's been abused regarding this, and of course, in general, her house has been targeted. So, the only attack vector right now, I have two that I would put forth. Number one is knowledge. That's the first thing. and that covers everything. You're not leaving any ism or schism or ology unturned. That's just how it is. The second view of our chapters of English history has given us a means for taking spatial cross sections at several different dates of our society, which includes Great Britain, and which is the intelligible field of historical study. As far as Great Britain is concerned, in taking these cross sections, we shall have to distinguish between certain different planes of social life, the economic, the political, and the cultural, because it is already evident that the spatial extension of the society differs perceptibly according to the plane on which we focus our attention. At the present day and on the economic plane, the society which includes Great Britain is undoubtedly coextensive with the whole inhabitable and navigable surface of the earth. On the political plane, again, the worldwide character of this society at the present day is almost equally apparent. When, however, we pass to the cultural plane, the present geographical extension of the society to which Great Britain belongs appears to be very smaller. Substantially, it is confined to the countries occupied by Catholic and Protestant peoples in Western Europe, America, and South Seas. In spite of certain exotic influences exercised on the society by such cultural elements in Russian literature, Chinese painting, Indian religion, and in spite of the much stronger cultural influences exercised by our own society on other societies, such as those of the Orthodox and Oriental Christians, and the Muslims, the Hindus, and the people of the Far East, it remains true that all of these are outside the cultural world to which we belong. So it's that cultural discord. So the cultural discord occurs because of the cultures being far apart. Now, culture does not necessarily mean it's tied to religion, though at times it can be, right? So, honor killing is something that is unfortunately part of some cultures, but it's not a religious act, it's not a religious thing. As we take further cross sections at earlier dates, we find that all three planes, the geographical limits of the society which we are examining, progressively contract. In a cross section taken about the year 1675, while the contraction is not perhaps very great on the economic plane, at least if we confine ourselves to the extension of trade and ignores volume, the boundaries of the political nature that the course of play in a cross section taken about 1 except profile is solving chain of structural in a formative cross section taken up strings to further. At the date, the area of our society's own structure, we were then the dominions of Charlemagne, together with the English successor states of Roman Empire and Britain. Outside these limits, all the Iberian Peninsula belongs to this date to the domain of the Muslim Arab Caliphate. Northern and northeast Europe is in the hands of unconverted barbarians. The northwestern fringes of the British Isles are held by far western Christians. South of southern Italy is under the rule of Byzantines. Let's call the society whose spatial limits we have been studying Western Christendom, sorry. And as soon as we bring our mental image of it into focus by finding a name for it, the images and names of its counterparts in the contemporary world come into focus side by side with it, especially if we keep our attention fixed upon the cultural plane. That's the thing. keeping it fixed on the disgusting, abhorrent people. On this plane, we can distinguish unmistakably the presence of the world today of at least four other living societies of the same species as ours. Number one, an Orthodox Christian society in southeastern Europe and Russia. On this plane, same species as ours. Like how we said same species. That's an interesting wordplay there. An Orthodox Christian society in Southeast Europe and Russia. Islamic society with its focus in the arid zone, which stretches diagonally across North Africa and the Middle East from the Atlantic to the outer face of the Great Wall of China. Hindu society in the tropical subcontinent of India. Far Eastern society in the subtropical and temperate regions between the arid zone and the Pacific. On closer inspection, we can also discern two sets of what appear to be fossilized relics of similar societies now extinct, namely one set including the monophysite Christians of Armenia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Abyssinia, Nestorian Christians of Kurdistan, and ex-Nestorians in Malabar, as well as the Jews and the Parsis, and a second set including the Lamaistic Mahayana Buddhists of Tibet, Mongolia, and the Hinayan Buddhists of Ceylon, Burma, Siam, Cambodia, as well as the Jains of India. It is interesting to notice that when we turn back to the cross sections at 775, we find that the number and identity of the societies on the map are nearly the same as at the present time. Substantially, the world map of societies of this species has remained constant since the first emergence of our Western society. In the struggle for existence, the West has driven its contemporaries to the wall and entangled them in the meshes of its economic and political ascendancy. I love that. In the struggle for existence, the West has driven its contemporaries to the wall and entangled them in the mesh of its economic and political ascendancies, but it has not yet disarmed them of their distinctive cultures. Hard pressed though they are, they can still call their souls their own. So that's what I was talking about earlier, how like a tennis ball being moved between the economic, socio-political economic clashes. The conclusion of the argument, as far as we have carried it at present, is that we should draw a sharp distinction between relations of two kinds: those between communities within the same society and those of different societies with one another. And now, having explored the extension of our Western society in space, we have to consider its extension in time. And we are at once confronted with the fact that we cannot know its future, a limitation which greatly restricts the amount of light that the study of this particular society or any of the still extant societies can throw on the nature of the species to which these societies belong. We must content ourselves with the exploration of our Western society beginnings. Interesting. That's quite a solid argument, briefly put. Right. When Charlemagne's dominions were partitioned by between his three grandsons, Treaty of Verdun in 843, Lothair, as the eldest, established his claim to possess his grandfather's two capitals of Aachen and Rome, and in order that these might be connected by a continuous belt territory, Lothair was assigned a portion which struggled across the face of West Europe from the mouths of Tiber and Po to the mouth of the Rhine. Lothair's portion is commonly regarded as one of the curiosities of historical geography. Nonetheless, the three Carolingian brothers were right in what believing that it was a zone of particular importance in our Western world. Wherever its future might be, it had a great past behind it. And then he talks about West and so on. Fratricidal warfare. See that? Right, so we're going to look at Toynbee's view on Islamic society. The Iranic and Arabic society and the Syriac society. The next living society that we have to examine is Islam. And when we can scan the background of the Islamic society, we discern there are universals. We discern there a universal state, a universal church, and a world wandering, which are not identical with those common in the background of Western Orthodox Christendom, but are unmistakably analogous to them. The Islamic universal state is the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad. The universal church is, of course, Islam itself. The Volk-Wanderung, which overran the domain of the Caliphate at its fall, proceeded from the Turkish and Mongol nomads of the Eurasian steppe, the Berber nomads of northern Africa, and the Arab nomads of Arabian Peninsula. The interregnum occupied by this Volga wandering covers roughly the 3 centuries between 975 and 1275, and the latter date can be taken as that of the beginning of the Islamic society as we find it in the world today. Overall explain this. A cataclysmic conquest of the primitive Muslim Arabs seemed to respond catastrophically. Catastrophic. Never heard that word before. Right, so I'm just going through some interesting point Toynbee's bringing up what he's saying from the Arab Iranic point of view, that the Arabs, when taking over Iran, had this cultural commonality by virtue of the Abbasid Caliphate's capital being Baghdad. Now, what's interesting is that the class that Arabic, the language, was the vehicle of culture in the Arabic zone, and this had been the language during the Abbasid Caliphate, and even before when Umar alayhi salam had entered into that place. So, in the Iranian zone, the new culture found a new vehicle for itself, Persian language. For the Arabic zone, pardon me, Arabic zone found Arabic as a language, Persians found Persian by grafting it onto Arabic, as Latin had been cultivated by grafting it onto Greek. Okay. One phrase, one sentence here I don't understand. He says, so behind the Abbasid Caliphate, we find the Umayyad, and behind that 1,000 years of Hellenistic intrusion, beginning with Alexander in the latter half of 4th century, followed by Greek Seleucid monarchy in Syria, Pompey campaign, and the Roman conquest, and only ending with Oriental revanche and the worries of early Islam in the 7th century after Christ. The cataclysmic conquests of the primitive Muslim Arabs seem to respond antistrophically in the rhythm of history to the cataclysmic conquests of Alexander. Like these, they changed the face of the world in half a dozen years, but instead of changing it out of recognition, more Macedonical, they changed it back to recognizable likeness of what it had been once before. As the Macedonian conquest, as the Macedonian conquest by breaking up the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire of Cyrus and his successors prepared the soil for the seed of Hellenism, so the Arab conquest opened way for Umayyad and after them the Abbasid to reconstruct the universal state which was equivalent to the Achaemenid Empire. Ah, right, I see. So it's okay, now he clarifies it. If we superimpose the map of either empire upon the other, we shall be struck by the closeness by which the outlines correspond, and we shall find that the correspondence is not simply geographical, but extends to methods of administration, and even we find that the correspondence is not just geographical, extends to methods of administration, even to more intimate phenomena of social spiritual life. We may express the historical function of Abbasid Caliphate by describing it as a reintegration and resumption of the Achaemenid Empire, a reintegration of a political structure which had been broken up by the impact of an external force, and the resumption of a phase of social life which had been interrupted by an alien intrusion. The Abbasid is to be regarded as a resumption of the universal state, which was the last piece of the existence of our still unidentified society, the search for which is thus shifted back 1,000 years. We now must inspect the immediate antecedents of the Achaemenid Empire in search of the phenomena which we failed to find in the antecedents of the Abbasids, namely a time of troubles resembling the time which the Hellenic history immediately precedes the establishment of the Roman Empire. The general similarity between the genesis of the Achaemenid Empire and the genesis of the Roman Empire is unmistakable. The chief difference of detail is that the Hellenic universal state grew out of the very state which had been the principal agents of destruction in the foregoing time of troubles, whereas in the genesis of the Achaemenid Empire, the successive destructive constructive roles of the Roman Empire were played by different states. The destructive role the destructive role the destructive role played by Assyria. But just when Assyria was on the point of completing her work by establishing a universal state in the society which was the scourge, she brought destruction on herself by the excess of her own militarism. Just before the grand finale of the protagonist was dramatically struck down, 610 BC, and his role was unexpectedly assumed by an actor who had hitherto in the moment played a minor part. Mm. The Achaemenidae reaped where the Assyrians had sown. Yet the substitution of one performer for another did not change the character of the plot. Having thus discerned our time of troubles, we can now perhaps at last identify the society we are seeking. Negatively, we can make out that it was not identical with that to which the Assyrians belong. The Assyrians, like the Macedonians at a later stage of this long tangled history, played their part as intruders who came and went in an identified society where it was united under the Achaemenid Empire. We can trace the process of the peaceful ejection. of the elements of the culture intruded by Assyria and the gradual replacement of the Akkadian language and cuneiform script in our unidentified society when it was united under Achaemenid Empire. We can trace the process of the peaceful ejection of the elements culture intruded by Assyria and the gradual replacement of the Akkadian and cuneiform script by the Aramaic language and alphabet. The Assyrians themselves, in their latter days, employed the Aramaic alphabet for writing on parchment, a supplement to the traditional cuneiform script, which impressed on clay tablets or inscribed on stone. When they employed the Aramaic alphabet, they may be presumed to have used the Aramaic language. At any rate, the destruction of Assyrian state of the short-lived Neo-Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, which followed it, the Aramaic alphabet language continuously gained ground until in the last century BC. The Akkadian language and cuneiform script has become extinct throughout the Mesopotamian homeland. Corresponding change can be traced in the history of the Iranian language, which emerged suddenly from obscurity as the language of the Medes and the Persians. The ruling peoples of Achaemenid Empire, confronted with the problem of making records in a language, Iranian or Persian, which had evolved no script of its own. The Persians adopted the cuneiform script for inscription on stone and the Aramaic for records on parchment, but it was Aramaic script that survived as a vehicle of Persian language. In fact, two elements of culture, one from Syria and one from Iran, were asserting themselves contemporaneously, and at the same time entering into closer association with one another. From the latter end of the empire, from the latter end of the time of troubles preceding the establishment of the Achaemenid Empire, when then conquered Aramaeans were beginning to captivate their Assyrian conquerors. The process was continuous. If we wish to discern it at an earlier stage, we may look into the mirror of religion and perceive how the same time of troubles breathed the inspiration into Zarathustra, the prophet of Iran, and contemporary prophets of Israel and Judah. On the whole, the Aramaean or Syrian element, rather than Iranian, may be regarded as the deeper influence, and if we peer back behind the time of troubles, the Iranian element fades out, and we catch a glimpse of society in Syria and the generation of King Suleiman al-Islam, and his contemporary King Hiram, which was just discovering the Atlantic Indian Oceans and had already discovered the alphabet. Here, at last, we have identified a society to which the twin Islamic societies subsequently combined in one were affiliated, and we call it a Syriac society. So, language, culture, and these things are obviously at play. In the light of this identification, let us look again at Islam, the universal church through which our Syriac society came at long last to be apparented to the Iranic and Arabian societies. We can now observe an interesting difference between the development of Islam and that of Christianity. We have observed that the germ of creative power in Christianity was not of Hellenic but of alien origin. We observe the germ of creative power in Christianity was not Hellenic but of alien origin, in fact, Syriac as we have now identified. By contrast, we can observe that the creative germ of Islam was not alien but native to the Syriac society. The founder, Muhammad drew his inspiration primarily from Judaism, a purely Syriac religion, and secondarily from Nestorianism, from which this preponderance of course of institution like the industry is never purebred from a single society. Not true. That's not true. You didn't take any inspiration in that way. Of course, a great institution like a universal church is never purebred. In Christianity, we are aware of Hellenic elements drawn from Hellenic mystery, religious religions, and Hellenic philosophies. Similarly, but to a much slightly slighter extent, we can detect Hellenic influence in Islam. Broadly speaking, however, Christianity is a universal church originating in a gem that was alien to society in which it is made about. While Islam originated in a germ that was indigenous. Finally, we measure the respective degrees of displacement of the original homes of the affiliated Iranic and Arabic societies from the original home of the apparent Syriac society. The baseline of the Iranic Islamic society from Anatolia to India show a big displacement. On the other hand, homeland of the Arabic Islamic society in Syria, Egypt covers the whole area of Syriac society, and the displacement is relatively small. Hmm. Right. So what I'm going to do is try and touch on Guy Eaton. I like this phrase. So Guy Eaton says, vice pays its tribute to virtue by masquerading behind the mask of religion or of a political ideology, and wickedness walks the streets more confidently when decently clothed. Would be foolish to say the least, counterproductive to seek for arguments to excuse divisions within the Ummah, wars between Muslim states, brutality and hypocrisy of certain national leaders, corrupt practices of the rich, or the hysteria of zealots and who have forgotten the fundamental law of mercy and the binding obligation to make use of the divine gift of intelligence. We live in an age of fitna. This term is usually translated as civil commotion. An alternative translation is fermentation, and it is characteristic of the process of fermentation that it brings the scum to the surface. So yeah, we live in fitna and fermentation due to civil commotion, and same case in Western so-called Christendom as we see it today. And yeah, scum comes to the surface. Question is, why is one scum under the microscope more than the other? Surely both have the same death and disease attached to it, or dirt. At the same time, it must be borne in mind that despite the fairly recent division of the Ummah into nation states, Muslims still identify man in terms of the religion into which he was born rather than in terms of his nationality, let alone his racial origin. Since they find it difficult to grasp the fact that there are people in this world who do not even profess to believe in God, any God, they habitually refer to all Europeans as Christians. Quite common to hear Adolf cited as an example of how badly Christians behave. By the same token, everyone who happens to have been born in the Islamic world is described as Muslim. Westerners take this designation at its face value, and shabby tyrants who are distant from Islam, as was Adolf from Christianity, are seen as Muslims. The religion as such is judged or misjudged in terms of their behavior. Fascinating. So, from the time of Christianity came to the Roman Empire, Christian messages. Since Islam was strong in all the Christians, was later the false. Hope innocent third and identified as its formats. This is interesting. So, Guy Eaton states that there has been a failure of cross cultural communication. The actual means of communication is the way in which the religion needs to be presented nowadays has been forged not out of Islamic materials but into the West. Well, not out of Islamic but in Western. The Muslim writer finds himself obliged to work with tools which do not fit comfortably in his hands. Moreover, traditional Muslims who have escaped the influence of modern, that is to say, Occidental education, have no understanding of the Occidental mind, which is strange to them, as it would be to a Christian of the Middle Ages. Since the Renaissance, European man has ventured out beyond the barriers set up by traditional civilization against all such strain. In doing so, he may have done irreparable damage to himself, but he has become sophisticated in a way that makes other cultures seem naive in comparison. There was a time when it was otherwise. Call the Ox- Plato could call the Orientals old in comparison with the innocent youthfulness of the Greeks. Now it is Europeans who are old, having seen so much and being burdened with intolerable memories. There was a time when Plato called traditional rights with authority function by This is an interesting phrase. He says, Uncle Toms are still with us. Contemporary Muslim writers cannot be accused of taking no pride in Islam. Indeed, this pride is sometimes expressed with stringent tones, and no one could claim that they are uncritical of Western decadence, though their criticism needs to miss the mark. Focus on symptoms rather than on causes. They have not, however, escaped from a different kind of subservience to Occidental norms. They tend to deeply they tend to be deeply considered al-Nahda, renewal, Islamic Renaissance, which they really compare with the Renaissance in Europe. Yet the European Renaissance was, from the religious point of view, a rebirth of paganism which Christianity had supplanted, and it was the source of that very decadence which Muslims perceive in Western life and thought their inherent hostility to Christianity blinds them to the fact that forces and ideologies, okay, which destroyed one religion may easily destroy another, or if they do see this, they believe that Islam's inherent strength from its capacity to absorb and Islamicize alien elements will protect it from subversion. This is to say, at least, a dangerous gamble. Right. So, inshallah, I'm going to do further breakdown of this very interesting introduction, probably the best introductions. Till next time, Salam.